Hoo boy, we got a doozy for you today. So I think Blackbeard is going to be the forest deity. I think he's going to become such because of some things that we see throughout the story and because of what his final Zoan fruit will be. Now, over the course of my time on YouTube, I have always said that Blackbeard was going to either have the devil fruit or some sort of snake fruit. I'm leaning more towards the snake fruit now because, of course, our devil fruit character is Emu. Spoilers for Elbaf, by the way, but Emu has been revealed recently as of this recording, and it's no surprise that they are a devil based on the abilities they are able to do, and we've done a video covering that. However, I think the fruit that Blackbeard will get is a Hydra fruit. Said Hydra in the One Piece lore, I believe, is the forest deity because in One Piece, thanks to the flashback of Skypiea, we know that there are 4 deities of importance in the One Piece world to look out for. The sun deity Nika, the rain deity Zaza, and then an unknown forest and earth deity, right? So I think the Hydra in this case is our forest deity. And it's interesting that this is the case for Blackbeard because over the course of the series, there are themes that come up quite often in his various appearances. And those are snakes, a forest, and a civilization. And I'll be going over as to why all these themes are important and why he would be getting a Hydra fruit specifically. Now, in talking about devil fruits in general, I think I need to talk about Remo Shifu Killingham. Remo Shifu Killingham is a holy knight that we meet in Elbaf. The reason why he is important is because he kicks off the entire idea of if a creature is presented in One Piece, most likely that's how the people of this world see this creature, and most likely this creature is real in some regard or another, meaning that the creature in question most likely is a mythical Zoan type devil fruit somewhere out there in the world. So from the examples that we get from Killingham, we know now that his nightmare creatures, the Nidhogg and Zaza, most likely are devil fruits out there in the world. And the one confirmed one that we have is the Nidhogg, because as Killingham summons a Nidhogg based on the thoughts of the people of Elbaf, we see that Loki actually has eaten the dragon fruit mythical type model Nidhogg and can become a giant black lightning breathing dragon. Much like the nightmare creature of the same name, the Nidhogg was a black lightning breathing dragon. So with all that being said, it's very likely that this new nightmare creature, the rain deity Zaza, is too a devil fruit somewhere out there in the world that someone will eat. Now, turning our attention to what I assume is the forest deity, the Hydra. And I need to say this outright to set the stage. I think King Ghidorah from Godzilla is going to be in One Piece. If you don't know, King Ghidorah is the arch nemesis of Godzilla. However, it appears most often as a 3-headed wyvern that is bipedal. Its first appearance was in the film Ghidorah, the 3-headed monster, which debuted in 1964. With that being said, what's also quite interesting is that some sources say that its original inspiration was the Japanese monster of legend called the Yamato no Orochi, which should sound pretty familiar regarding One Piece, but we'll get to that when we get to it. However, some other origins that it's had over the years in its many appearances in film are a guardian monster of ancient Japan or a deity from a different dimension, which are going to serve our explanations here. So, with that being said, we have seen a creature like this in One Piece before. let's cut to Impel Down. In Impel Down, the main antagonist of that arc is named Magellan. At the time, he was the chief warden. However, in using his paramecia abilities of the Venom fruit, he is known for making two constructs, one being the Hydra and the other being Venom Demon. Now, before we get to the Hydra, let's look at Venom Demon. Venom Demon is a large, horned, humanoid entity that serves to be his sort of ultimate technique that has various connotations to it being an awakened ability. However, we then see this entity again way later in Elbaf, whom we assume is the same entity that Emu can become. Because the one thing that the mural depiction and the Venom Demon have in common is that they are both large, almost ghost-like entities with big horns, wings, and these big humanoid grabby hands. And that is what Emu is alluded to be in their full beast state once they were fighting Sabo. So it's very likely, based on what we've seen of Emu so far in Elbaf, that the Venom Demon was actually a foreshadowing to what Emu would eventually be. Now, using that same logic, let's apply that to the Hydra. And this is quite funny and ironic because Magellan fights Blackbeard in this arc, and he poisons his entire crew with Hydra, which in itself I think is foreshadowing, but to continue. Now, based on what we've talked about with Remo Shifu Killingham and what we've talked about with the Venom Demon and being in relation to Emu, it is very likely that the Hydra is a real devil fruit out there in the world. And the reason why I brought up King Ghidorah is because the depiction of the Hydra is very similar looking to King Ghidorah. Here, the Hydra in One Piece is depicted as a large wyvern with 3 heads usually, whom is bipedal because the Hydra that Magellan makes has hind legs and a set of wings, so it looks like King Ghidorah. Now, we know that Magellan didn't make this creature up on his own, because when Magellan is depicted as a child, we see the same creature on his shirt. This implies that the Hydra is a known legend in the One Piece world. Therefore, I could believe that there is a devil fruit out there that contains the power to become said beast. I think that devil fruit will be called the snake fruit mythical type model Hydra. Now, why am I calling it a snake and not a dragon, seeing as how King Ghidorah and the Hydra that Magellan makes are very draconic? Well, we know that based on the origins of King Ghidorah, supposedly, its origins lie in being inspired by the Yamato no Orochi. This creature is already in One Piece. It's not a Hydra per se, but it's very similar. And it too is a snake fruit that once belonged to Orochi in Wano. But the reason why it's not a Hydra per se, like in Greek myth, because the power that Orochi had is very similar to having extra lives as opposed to regeneration, which is why it's most likely going to be regarded as a different ability onto itself. But it too gave Orochi the power to become a reptilian creature with limbs in his full beast state. So limbs don't disqualify you from being a snake in One Piece, apparently. I don't make the rules up. That's how it is, because when we see Orochi turn into his full beast form in Wano, when he's fighting the scabbards, we see that he has limbs. So it is what it is. That's why I say that the Hydra fruit, most likely, despite being a wyvern, is most likely going to be a snake fruit. But how does this relate to the 4 deities described to us in Skypiea? Well, I think that in the mural that we see in Elbaf, under the description of the first world, is our Hydra, the snake that we see amongst the civilization. because I don't necessarily think that this is the full body of the serpent. I think the serpent in question is just showing one of its heads, and it's actually a full wyvern, much like King Ghidorah. I think that its body is massive, and we're only seeing a small part of it in this illustration. However, with all that being said, let's start to connect Blackbeard to civilizations, forests, and snakes. So, you know that we meet Blackbeard in Jaya. Jaya was once home to the Shandians. The Shandians lived in Shandora. Shandora was a civilization that worshipped snakes and put a great emphasis on the forest, describing the trees as the final resting places for their ancestors, correct? So, with that being said, we have now a civilization that Blackbeard goes to, technically, that worships snakes and had an emphasis on the forest. We see Blackbeard in modern Jaya after Shandora has been knocked up into the sky. And I don't think that was a mistake. I think setting the stage here prompts us for other appearances of Blackbeard in the future and the eventual power that he will get. So the next major place that we see Blackbeard is in Impel Down. Impel Down is a civilization of sorts because it's a large building that houses the criminals of the world. But the funny thing about Impel Down is that it has a forest inside of it, which is very peculiar. But yes, level 1 is actually a forest called the Crimson Hell, and it has a bunch of needly trees and needly grass stained with the blood of the people whom have bled on the foliage of this area. So it's weird that this civilization has a forest that is given importance, but it also has a serpent, technically 2 serpents, because one, we have a basilisk, which is a gigantic snake born from a chicken egg. So we have an actual serpentine creature here. But then we have Magellan himself, whom is able to summon a Hydra using the abilities of his Venom fruit. And this Hydra consumes, quotation marks, consumes Blackbeard and his crew. Again, I think that was very purposeful to show Blackbeard confronting the serpent of this location. But to continue, after Blackbeard becomes a Yonko in the post-time skip, he invades Amazon Lily. Amazon Lily is a very interesting location because it's all about snakes, much like ancient Shandora, because the women of Amazon Lily use snakes as weapons. But also, quite interestingly, the mountain head of Amazon Lily shows multiple snake heads, which I've always found very interesting. However, there is also another emphasis on snakes because we have 2 snake fruit users here. The first of the series, actually, in Boa Sandersonia and Boa Marigold. And then 2, we have Boa Hancock, who propagates the legend of the Gorgon and is accompanied by a giant snake in Solomon. But what's also quite wild about Amazon Lily is that the forest of Amazon Lily is emphasized because when Luffy crash lands there after Kuma sends him there, he is attacked by body mushrooms in the forest where he meets Marguerite. So even though it's slight, the forest is emphasized. This is also the same place in which Blackbeard faces off against the Seraphim known as S-Hawk, and this is also the same arc in which we are introduced to the Seraphim known as S-Snake, a Seraphim clone of Boa Hancock. So the forest is greatly emphasized in this arc, as well as the snake theming, and of course, the island of Amazon Lily is a civilization. Just so happens to be a civilization that worships snakes. So maybe he went there not for Boa Hancock's power, but maybe he went there looking for the Hydra fruit. But a theme of note, getting back to these locations that Blackbeard has visited, is that in each location we have multiple snakes and sometimes multi-headed snake theming, because in Jaya, when it was still Shandora, we have 3 generations of bearded snake. The youngest one is the one that we see in the Skypiea arc named Nola, but Nola had a parent and a grandparent preceding them in the past. However, then when we look at Impel Down, we have multiple snakes technically in the Basilisk and in Magellan, but Magellan summons a multi-headed snake in his Hydra construct. However, when we go over to Amazon Lily, a ton of Hydra theming is on display because the mountain has multiple heads, making the mountain of Amazon Lily look like a Hydra. And it's even more interesting that as Hawk severs the mountain in half during the post-time skip when Blackbeard invades. So that might be foreshadowing within itself. But then we have multiple snake-themed characters who run the island. Sandersonia and Marigold being Zoan fruit users, and then, of course, Hancock. This was also the introduction of S-Snake, the Seraphim clone of Boa Hancock. So that is still yet another snake-themed character. And as an aside, which is also quite interesting, but he visits a snake-themed place at least once during major parts of his career. When he's just starting out with a bounty of 0, he is in Jaya. But then when he is a warlord, he goes to Impel Down. However, when he is at the height of his career as a Yonko, he visits Amazon Lily. So we have 3 times that he visits a snake-themed place technically at 3 different points in his pirate career. So I find it very interesting that in the locations that Blackbeard visit, we not only have a snake theme going on between these locations, but multiple snakes in the location's history. And I think that is going to lead into Blackbeard ultimately becoming a multi-headed Hydra. Now, with that all being said, let's talk about Blackbeard a little specifically. Now, based on the fruits that Blackbeard has at his disposal right now, some will ask, well, don't you think he should be the Earth deity, seeing as how he has the darkness fruit and the tremor fruit? That's not how I think it works. I think the darkness fruit gives him the ability to eat multiple devil fruits, and the tremor fruit is just so he could have overwhelming power and or shore up some of the weaknesses that the darkness fruit and supposedly the Hydra fruit may have. But I do think the Hydra fruit is the final destination for Blackbeard because of the supposed foreshadowing that I think has been going on throughout the narrative based on the various locations that he has visited. Now, in terms of his whole way of moving throughout the narrative, I do think he is more fitting to be a forest deity because his main focus for as long as we've known him are devil fruits. So in a shorthand term, his main focus has been fruit, vegetation, something that you would find in a forest. He's always been focused on getting particular devil fruits for himself and for his subordinates. So he's been a very devil fruit focused character, and the Blackbeard Pirates have been a very devil fruit focused organization. So I don't think the land has anything to do with Blackbeard in particular, because there isn't much theming with him in association with land. So in talking about other aspects of Blackbeard, I do think people over the years might have been on to something, because one of the more popular theories about Blackbeard is that he would get a Cerberus fruit or a Kraken fruit. There's always a theme of him getting a Zoan fruit that gives him multiple appendages. So I think that's going to come to a head with the Hydra fruit, not to make the pun, which then would make his Jolly Roger make more sense, because in his Jolly Roger, we have 3 skulls and 4 crossbones. Those 3 skulls could represent the 3 Hydra heads that he most likely will have, or it could represent the 3 types of devil fruits that would be at his disposal, because at that time he would be a Logia fruit user, a Paramecia fruit user, and a Zoan fruit user. So I could see it working out in multiple ways. And the crossbones that cover the 8 corners of the world in his Jolly Roger could just mean conquest. So now, as I've said before, having these 3 devil fruits and being the Hydra could mean that he is the stuff of legend that will use his multiple powers to conquer all 8 corners of the globe. That's what I'm thinking. But then this, of course, would make him the king of the world. Now, going off of that point and looking at Blackbeard again, what's so interesting about the several snakes that we have talked about in these multitude of locations is that all of them have been highly venomous. Nola on Skypea is venomous. Boa Marigold, using the power of the snake fruit model King Cobra, is venomous, as we see her spit out venom. And then, of course, Magellan is a venom man. So, taking all that into consideration, I do think Blackbeard missing teeth over the course of several appearances is going to come into the fold here, and he will have a venomous bite as a Hydra. I think that is going to be something written in the cards. And in Greek mythology, the Hydra is said to be venomous. Another popular ability of the Hydra that you also see in multiple depictions, especially Disney's version of Hercules, is that the Hydra has the power of regeneration. When one head is cut off, more heads grow in its place. So I think in One Piece, other than Marco, I think the Hydra is going to be the only other mythical Zoan fruit that has the base power of regeneration in its arsenal. So taking it back to Greek mythology, and I front-loaded the video talking about One Piece specifically because I like using what we actually find in the series as opposed to different mythologies outside of the series, because you don't know what's actually going to be used from those mythologies within the series. But the Hydra can be found in Greek mythology, as you know, but it was the second of 12 of Hercules' labors. So the funny thing about the Hydra is that it was located in a swamp. A swamp is not a forest per se, but that is a very interesting connection that I think will be made in One Piece as to say why the Hydra is the forest deity of One Piece. Now, on top of that, what's even more interesting is that in One Piece right now, Blackbeard has employed Caribou. Caribou is the user of the swamp fruit. So he's the living embodiment of a swamp, but it's basically mud in his case. But it's very interesting that he has now employed a man who is a swamp, and now the Hydra was fought within a swamp. I just find that parallel very interesting because there's no actual reason for Caribou to have this fruit and for this fruit to be associated with Blackbeard. And it's even weirder when you consider that the swamp fruit and the darkness fruit have very similar abilities because they seem to have infinite storage associated with them. And another thing was quite weird about how they are used is that they don't work like traditional Logias because, of course, the darkness fruit emanates darkness and that darkness eats everything, right? But Caribou himself cannot produce mud that eats things. He himself has to extend his body out to eat objects and people. And then they go into the pocket dimension that is the swamp within his body. So it's weird that we have a similarity between one of Blackbeard's powers and Caribou's power, and now Caribou is the embodiment of a swamp, and the supposed fruit that I'm suggesting that Blackbeard would have to complete his collection is based on a creature that was fought in a swamp in Greek mythology. I just find that very weird, and I wonder is all this going to come together once he actually does find the Hydra fruit, presumably in the future. And the icing on the cake here is that we know now that Caribou is a fanboy of Blackbeard, much like how Bartolomeo is a fanboy of Luffy. Now, taking that into consideration, Bartolomeo's mission during Dressrosa was to win the flame fruit for Luffy. And now Caribou has been gathering information for Blackbeard. So I find that comparison very interesting as well, which is why I'm thinking that Caribou might indeed be a foreshadowing prelude to Blackbeard getting the Hydra fruit. And it's a super deep cut if this is a connection between the Hydra from Greek mythology being fought in a swamp. I think that's a super deep cut, but it makes a lot of sense. But do I think the Hydra is going to have any other vegetation powers? Probably not, because we have Green Bull with the Woods fruit, and then we have guys like Sommers with the Thorn fruit. So probably not. But that doesn't really put it out the running for being the deity of the forest, because Nika has nothing necessarily to do with the sun. So I don't think that's a means for disqualification. I think out of all the deities so far, the only one that's going to be very literal with its title and its abilities is Zaza, because Zaza, as we see in very recent chapters, does legit just have hydrokinesis. So yeah, out of all of them, Zaza will probably be the only one that's right on the nose. But now, as I've said in the past too, I do think his beard is going to grow again from eating this fruit, because his beard has had a theme of growing throughout his career when he gets to a new milestone. So when he becomes a Hydra, I do think he's going to have 3 different beards, seeing as how he'll be a multi-headed creature, and that beard might run through the entirety of his body as a Hydra, bearing some resemblance to the giant serpents of Skypiea, previously Jaya. And it's going to get more ridiculous, because as you cut more heads off, presumably he'll just keep regrowing them, and therefore he'll keep regrowing heads for a beard to form on time and time again, which is a bit of a joke within itself, because it's beard on beard on beard on beard. But with that being said, that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this type of stuff, click the like button. And if you want to see more from me, click the subscribe button followed by that bell so you never miss a video. In addition to, if you could, please hit the hype button, because it really does help. With that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What's it?